Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. I'd like to thank Deidre Bowman and Jordy for rejoining the Curator's Disciples. Your viewership is very much appreciated. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's Disciples. The link is in the description below. Story number 1. The Farm by the Curator. I guess I should start by saying that I'm not really a writer or anything. I'm just a regular person who got caught up in something really messed up. My name's Melanie, and this is the story of how I found my sister, Kat, and the nightmare we went through to get her back. It's a story I wish I didn't have to tell, but I need to get it out. Maybe it'll help someone else, or maybe it'll just help me sleep at night. Kat and I were always close. She's my little sister, only 2 years younger than me, and we've been through everything together. Our parents split up when I was 8, and Kat was 6. It was a nasty divorce, and the kind that leaves a scar on your heart, no matter how old you are. Dad wasn't around much after that. He moved to another state, and we only saw him during the holidays. Mom did her best to keep things normal, but it was hard. She had to work long hours just to keep food on the table and the lights on, so Kat and I learned to rely on each other. We shared a room in our small apartment, and that's where most of our memories are from. We'd spend hours playing with our dolls, building little worlds for them out of cardboard and old clothes. Kat always had the wildest imagination. She'd come up with these crazy stories, where the dolls were superheroes or secret agents on some impossible mission. And I'd always go along with it because, honestly, it was more fun than anything I could come up with. As we got older, that bond only grew stronger. I was the protective older sister, always looking out for her, while Kat was the brave one, always pushing us to try new things. She was the one who convinced me to sneak out at night when we were teenagers, climbing out of our bedroom window to meet up with friends. She was the one who dragged me to parties, even though I was more of a homebody. And she was the one who stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. There was this one time in high school when some girls were bullying me, spreading rumors that I'd done something I hadn't. I was too scared to confront them, but Kat marched right up to them in the middle of the cafeteria and told them off in front of everyone. I was so embarrassed at the time, but looking back, I realize how brave she was. She was always like that, fearless, loyal, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. But Kat wasn't just a tough girl. She had a huge heart, too. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, helping out with the dogs and cats. She couldn't stand to see anyone or anything in pain. I remember this one time we found a stray cat near our apartment. It was sick, its fur matted, and it could barely walk. I wanted to take it to the shelter, but Kat insisted we take care of it ourselves. She nursed that cat back to health, feeding it with a syringe and staying up all night with it when it was too weak to move. She named it Lucky, and it stayed with us until the day it died. That was Kat, always taking care of others, always putting their needs before her own. When we both finished high school, we had big dreams. I went off to college, while Kat decided to take a gap year to travel. She wanted to see the world, experience different cultures, and do some good along the way. She worked odd jobs, saving up enough money to backpack across Europe. She sent me postcards from every country she visited: France, Italy, Spain, each one with a little note about the people she met and the adventures she had. I was so proud of her, living her life to the fullest, doing things I could only dream of. But then she came back home, and something had changed. She didn't talk about her trip as much as I expected. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. She seemed more restless, more on edge. I thought maybe it was just post-travel blues. But now, looking back, I wonder if something happened to her out there. Something she never told me about. A few months after she returned, she disappeared. It was a day like any other. She said she was going out to meet some friends and that she'd be back by dinner. But she never came home. At first, I wasn't too worried. She'd stayed out late before, and I figured she'd just crashed at a friend's place. But as the hours turned into days, I started to panic. We filed a missing person report, handed out flyers, searched the neighborhood, but nothing turned up. It was like she vanished into thin air. The police did their best, but after a few weeks, they stopped calling as much. It felt like they'd given up, but I couldn't. I knew something was wrong. Kat wouldn't just leave like that, not without telling me. So, I started searching on my own. I went through her things, trying to find any clue that might tell me where she'd gone. But everything was normal. No notes, no strange messages, nothing out of place. I started to lose sleep, spending nights on the computer, searching through every corner of the internet for anything that could help. I wasn't eating, wasn't going to work. I became obsessed with finding her. That's when I found out about the dark web. I didn't know much about it at first, just that it was this hidden part of the internet where all the really bad stuff happens. But I was desperate. I'd heard that people could find all kinds of things on there, things the regular internet wouldn't show you. So, I started digging. I found forums, chat rooms, places where people talked about all sorts of sick, twisted stuff. It was like falling down a rabbit hole into a world I never knew existed. I saw things, horrible things, that I'll never be able to forget. And then, one night, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a site called The Farm. At first glance, it looked like some kind of members-only club. But as I clicked through the pages, I realized what it really was. A place where women were auctioned off as livestock for the rich and twisted. They were hunted for sport, like animals, by people who could pay enough to join the sick game. There were pictures, videos, descriptions of the women being sold off, and their so-called endurance levels. It was horrifying. I was about to click away, feeling sick to my stomach when I saw her. It was Kat. She was there, listed as one of the captives, a number where her name should have been. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the room was spinning, like I was going to pass out. But then the fear turned into anger, and I knew I had to do something. I had to find her, no matter what it took. After that night, everything in my life took a back seat to finding Kat. I became obsessed with the farm, spending every waking moment trying to figure out how to get in, how to stop them, how to save her. But the farm wasn't just some regular website. It was buried deep in the dark web, hidden behind layers of encryption and security. You couldn't just sign up. You had to be invited, or you had to prove you were someone worth letting in. I didn't know the first thing about hacking or any of that technical stuff, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. I started researching, learning how to navigate the dark web, how to use Tor, how to stay anonymous. I found forums where people talked about the farm, mostly in hushed, terrified whispers. Some claimed to have seen it. Others said it was just a rumor, a ghost story to scare people. But I knew it was real because I'd seen Kat's face on that site. I created a fake identity, posing as a potential buyer. I stole credit card information from the internet. God knows where it came from. used it to purchase access to some of the lower-level sites connected to the farm. It was terrifying, every step of the way. I kept expecting the police to bust down my door, or for some shadowy figure to track me down. But I didn't care. I had to find Kat. Finally, after what felt like weeks of digging, I got in. I don't know how, but I managed to find the right contact, say the right things, and prove I was serious. I was given access to the bidding site. My hands were shaking as I clicked the link, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified of what I might see, but I couldn't turn back now. The site was even worse than I'd imagined. It was sleek, professional, like an upscale auction house, but instead of fine art or rare antiques, they were selling human beings. Women, young and old, were displayed like cattle, each one given a number, a brief description, and a starting bid. There were categories for everything: age, race, body type, even condition. The worst part was the chat. The buyers were discussing the women like they were nothing, making jokes, placing bets on how long they'd last. It made me sick, but I kept scrolling, searching for any sign of Kat. I didn't have to look far. She was there, number 47, with a short video clip of her being dragged to a cage. She looked terrified, her eyes wild with fear, but she was alive. Seeing her like that, so vulnerable, so scared, it nearly broke me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tear the whole world apart until I got her back. But I couldn't do any of that. All I could do was keep moving forward, keep playing the part, and figure out how to get her out of there. The bidding process was sickening. It was all done in real time, with potential buyers placing their bids while making crude, disgusting comments about the women. They were talking about my sister like she was a piece of meat, like her life didn't matter. The anger in me kept growing, but I had to keep it together. I had to think clearly if I was going to save her. I knew I couldn't just outbid everyone and take Kat home. That would raise too many questions, and I didn't have the kind of money these people were throwing around. I needed to find out where the next hunt was going to be held and get there before it started. I scoured the site, looking for any clues about the location. The buyers were careful, never mentioning anything directly, but there were hints, subtle references to a new estate and exclusive hunting grounds. I pieced together what I could, and eventually I found a forum thread where the hunters discussed logistics, travel plans, weather conditions, and the best times to arrive. The estate was in a remote part of the country, far from any major cities. It was surrounded by dense forests, miles away from civilization. Perfect for what they were planning. The hunt was set to take place in just a few days, and I knew I had to act fast. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I didn't sleep much, and when I did, I dreamed of Kat. Alone, scared, running for her life. I bought supplies, packed a bag, and drove out to the estate. The place was as isolated as I'd imagined, hidden deep in the woods with a long, winding road leading up to it. There was no way I could just walk in the front door, so I parked a few miles away and hiked through the forest, using a map I'd found online to guide me. The estate was massive, with tall, wrought iron gates and high walls surrounding the property. I could see security cameras mounted on the walls, sweeping the area with their cold, unblinking eyes. There was no way I'd be able to sneak in without being seen, so I waited until nightfall. The forest was thick with shadows, the trees towering overhead, their branches swaying in the wind. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you feel like you're being watched. When the sun finally set, I made my move. I'd brought a pair of bolt cutters, and I used them to snip through a section of the fence just out of sight of the cameras. My heart was pounding the whole time, every snap of the cutters sounding like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. But I managed to get through, slipping into the estate grounds like a shadow. The place was even bigger on the inside. There were several large buildings, mansions, really, spread out across the property, with perfectly manicured lawns and gardens in between. I could see lights on in the windows, the glow of chandeliers spilling out into the night. There were people inside, mingling, drinking, laughing, completely oblivious to the fuckery that was about to unfold. I stuck to the shadows, moving quickly but carefully, trying to get a better look at what I was dealing with. There were guards patrolling the grounds, armed with guns and wearing earpieces. They looked professional, like ex-military or something. These weren't just some random thugs. They were highly trained and ready for anything. I knew I'd have to be careful. I managed to get close to one of the buildings, peering through a window into what looked like a staging area. There were rows of cages inside, each one holding a woman. Some were crying, others were silent, staring blankly at the walls. My heart ached when I saw them, but I couldn't let myself get distracted. I had to find Kat. I moved around to the back of the building, where I found a service entrance. The door was locked, but I'd come prepared. I pulled out a lock-picking kit I'd bought and started working on the door. My hands were shaking, and it took longer than I'd hoped, but eventually I got it open. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I held my breath, praying no one had heard it. But the inside was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I slipped inside, moving quickly but silently, sticking to the walls and staying out of sight. The place was a maze of corridors and rooms, but I finally found what I was looking for. A large room filled with cages, each one holding a woman. And there, in the far corner, was Kat. She was sitting on the floor of her cage, her knees drawn up to her chest, her head resting on her arms. She looked exhausted, her clothes torn and dirty, her hair matted. But she was alive. I wanted to run to her, to break open the cage and get her out of there, but I knew I had to be smart about this. If I made a noise, if I alerted anyone, we were both dead. I crept closer, staying low until I was right next to her cage. "Kat," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't move at first, but then she slowly lifted her head, her eyes widening as she recognized me. "Mel," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "Shh, it's me," I said, reaching through the bars to touch her hand. "I'm here to get you out." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she bit her lip, trying to keep from crying out. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Of course I came," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "I'm getting you out of here. But you have to be quiet, okay? We can't let anyone know we're here." She nodded, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. I pulled out the lock-picking kit again and started working on the lock. My hands were shaking even more now, but I forced myself to focus. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the click of the lock and the door swung open. Kat practically fell into my arms, her whole body trembling. I held her close, trying to calm her down, but we didn't have time to waste. We needed to get out of there before someone noticed we were gone. "Come on," I whispered, taking her hand. "We need to go." We moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the guards. But just as we were about to reach the fence where I'd cut through, I heard footsteps behind us. I turned around, my heart in my throat, and saw one of the guards standing there, his gun raised. "Stop right there," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. I froze, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could react, Cat grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the guard's head. It hit him with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "Run!" Cat shouted, pulling me along with her. We sprinted for the fence, my legs burning with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest. We reached the hole, scrambling through just as more guards started shouting and running after us. We didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running through the forest, the sound of their voices growing fainter behind us. By the time we finally stopped, we were deep in the woods, far from the estate. Both of us were gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. But we were alive. We were safe for now. We didn't stop running until we were sure we'd put enough distance between us and the estate. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. It was dark, and the ground was uneven, covered in roots and underbrush that made it difficult to move quickly. But we had no choice. We had to keep going. Cat was struggling to keep up. She was exhausted, her legs barely able to carry her after everything she'd been through. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting the hunters to come crashing through the trees at any moment. "We need to keep moving," I urged, taking her hand and pulling her along. "We're not safe yet." "I know," she panted, her voice shaking. "I'm just so tired, Mel. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." I knew she was right. We couldn't keep running forever, but we couldn't stop either. Not here, not in the middle of the forest, where we were sitting ducks. We needed to find shelter, someplace to hide, until we could figure out what to do next. Just then, we heard the sound of something moving in the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled Cat closer, instinctively ducking down behind a fallen tree. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moon peeking through the dense canopy above. The sound grew louder, like someone or something was crashing through the woods, moving quickly and recklessly. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. Cat was trembling beside me, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. We waited, every muscle in my body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of danger. But then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the snap of a twig. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I could feel Cat's fear rising, her breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. I knew we couldn't stay here, couldn't wait for whatever was out there to find us. We had to move, and we had to do it now. "Come on," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We need to go. Slowly, and stay low." Cat nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We started moving, crawling through the underbrush, careful not to make any noise. The ground was uneven and covered in leaves and branches that crackled under our weight, but we did our best to move as silently as possible. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The rustling of leaves, the crunch of twigs, the sound of our own breathing. We made our way deeper into the forest, putting as much distance between us and whatever was out there. But the deeper we went, the more we realized we were hopelessly lost. The trees all looked the same, their branches twisting and gnarled, creating an almost maze-like effect. There was no path, no way to tell which direction we were heading. The only thing we knew for sure was that we had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, we finally stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of open ground surrounded by thick trees, but it was a relief to be out of the dense underbrush. We collapsed onto the ground, both of us gasping for breath, our bodies aching from the effort. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Kat whispered, her voice shaky. "We're going to be okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We just need to keep moving until we find a way out." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't that simple. The estate was huge, and the forest surrounding it was vast. It could take us hours, maybe even days, to find our way out, and we had no idea what else might be out there, hunting us. I looked around the clearing, trying to get my bearings. The moon was higher now, casting long shadows across the ground. I could see the outline of a large tree at the edge of the clearing, its branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Something about it made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "We should keep moving," I said, getting to my feet and helping Kat up. "We can't stay here." But just as I said that, I heard it again. That same low growl, coming from the direction of the tree. My blood ran cold, and I froze, my eyes locked on the darkness beneath the branches. Then, out of the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, staring right at us. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Kat's hand and pulling her away from the clearing. We sprinted back into the forest, the sound of growling growing louder behind us. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to keep going. The trees whipped past us, their branches scratching at our skin, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. But no matter how fast we ran, the growling kept getting closer. I could hear the pounding of heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer and closer. Panic was setting in, and I knew we couldn't keep this pace for much longer. We needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to lose whatever was chasing us. "Over there," Kat shouted, pointing to a cluster of large boulders up ahead. We veered towards the boulders, scrambling up the rocks and squeezing into a narrow gap between them. The space was tight, barely big enough for the two of us, but it was the only place we could hide. We pressed ourselves against the cold, hard rock, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. The growling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give us away. I could feel Kat trembling beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. We waited, listening, our breaths shallow and rapid. And then we heard it, the sound of something sniffing around the rocks right above us. I could see a shadow moving in the darkness, the outline of something large and powerful. It was right on top of us, just inches away, and I knew if it found us, we were dead. I held my breath, praying it would move on, that it wouldn't find us. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense with fear. And then, finally, the shadow moved away, the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. We stayed there for a long time, too afraid to move, too scared to even breathe. When we were finally sure the creature was gone, we slowly crawled out from our hiding place, our bodies stiff and aching from being cramped in the narrow gap. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kat nodded, her face pale and drawn. We started moving again, more cautiously this time, staying close to the boulders for cover. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees looming over us like giants. Every sound made me jump, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending my heart racing. We were completely lost, and I had no idea where we were going. The forest was a labyrinth, and I knew we couldn't keep running forever. But we had no other choice. We had to keep moving, had to keep going, or we'd end up just like the women in those cages. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stumbled upon a dirt road cutting through the forest. It wasn't much, just a narrow, rutted path, but it was the first sign of civilization we'd seen since we'd fled the estate. "This has to lead somewhere," I said, trying to sound hopeful. "Maybe there's a cabin or a house up ahead." Kat looked exhausted, barely able to stand, but she nodded and followed me onto the road. We started walking, our feet dragging in the dirt, every step feeling like it took all the energy we had left. We walked for what felt like miles, the road winding through the forest with no end in sight. I was starting to lose hope, the fear and exhaustion weighing down on me, making it hard to think, hard to keep going. But then, up ahead, I saw something lights, faint but unmistakable, shining through the trees. "There," I said, grabbing Kat's arm and pointing. "There's something up ahead." We started running again, our exhaustion forgotten in our desperation to reach the lights. As we got closer, I could see that it was a house, a small, run-down cabin, the kind you'd expect to find deep in the woods. It didn't look like much, but it was shelter, and right now, that was all we needed. We reached the cabin and pounded on the door, hoping someone would be inside. But there was no answer. The place looked abandoned, the windows dirty and cracked, the wood peeling and weathered. But it was still better than being out in the open. "We can hide in here," I said, pushing the door open. The inside was just as run down as the outside, with old, dusty furniture and a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. But there was a fireplace and a few old blankets on the floor. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Kat and I collapsed onto the floor, our bodies too tired to move. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving us both feeling weak and drained. But at least we were safe, at least for now. "We need to rest," I said, pulling one of the blankets over us. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Kat nodded, her eyes already closing. I held her close, trying to keep the fear at bay, trying to convince myself that we were going to make it out of this alive. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. The hunters were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found us. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the cabin's walls. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, the events of the previous night feeling like a distant nightmare. But then I saw Kat, lying next to me, her face pale and bruised, and it all came rushing back. We were still in the middle of this hell, and there was no time to rest. We needed to keep moving, to find a way out before the hunters realized we were still here. I shook Kat gently, whispering her name until her eyes fluttered open. She looked as exhausted as I felt, but there was a determination in her gaze that gave me a little bit of hope. We both knew we couldn't stay here much longer. "Come on," I said softly, helping her to her feet. "We need to get moving." The cabin creaked as we stepped outside into the morning light. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed almost peaceful in the daylight, but I knew better than to trust appearances. The hunters could be anywhere, and we were still deep in their territory. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the endless forest stretching out in every direction. We'd been walking for about an hour when we came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a trap, expertly hidden among the leaves and branches. A simple but deadly snare, the kind used to catch animals. But this one wasn't meant for animals. It was meant for us. I knelt down, inspecting the trap, my mind racing. The hunters were playing a game, setting traps for us, like we were nothing more than prey. The thought made me sick, but I knew we had no choice but to keep moving. We had to be more careful, more aware of our surroundings. One wrong step, and it would all be over. Stay close to me, I told Cat, taking her hand. Watch where you step. There could be more of these. We continued on, our pace slower now, every step calculated and deliberate. The forest seemed to grow darker, the trees thicker and more twisted. It was like we were walking into a nightmare, every sense on high alert. The further we went, the more traps we found. Some were simple snares, like the first one, while others were more elaborate. Pits, covered with leaves, spikes hidden in the ground, even a net strung between the trees. It was clear the hunters had done this before, that they knew how to turn the forest into a death trap. But it wasn't just the traps that scared me. It was the remnants of those who had come before us. We found pieces of torn clothing, broken bones, and even a few old rusted weapons scattered among the leaves. Each discovery was a grim reminder of what we were up against, of the fate that awaited us if we weren't careful. As the day wore on, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The forest seemed to be closing in on us, the trees twisting and contorting like they were alive, like they were trying to trap us. The air was thick and suffocating, every breath feeling like a struggle. Cat was struggling to keep up, her steps growing slower and more unsteady. I could see the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion weighing her down. But we couldn't stop. Not yet. We're going to make it, I said, more to myself than to her. We just need to keep going. We'll find a way out. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. The traps were becoming more frequent, more deadly. It was only a matter of time before we made a mistake, before one of us got caught. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, we heard it. A faint, distant sound that sent a wave of terror through me. It was the sound of barking dogs, far off but getting closer. The hunters had unleashed their hounds. I grabbed Cat's hand and started running. We couldn't afford to be caught by those dogs. I'd heard stories about what they did to people, how they tore them apart, piece by piece. We ran as fast as we could, the sound of the dogs growing louder and more frantic. The forest was a blur around us, the trees whipping past as we pushed ourselves to the limit. But no matter how fast we ran, the dogs were getting closer. I could hear their snarls, their heavy breathing, the sound of their paws pounding the ground. And then, just as we were about to give up hope, but this one was different from the first. This one was a nightmare. The clearing was filled with traps, dozens of them, all laid out in a horrifying display of cruelty. There were spikes, pits, nets, and snares. And in the center of it all, hanging from a tree, was a body. It was a woman. She was dressed in torn, dirty clothes, her face pale and bruised. But what struck me the most was the look on her face, a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She had died in fear, and the hunters had left her there as a warning. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I stared at the gruesome scene. This was what we were up against. This was the fate that awaited us if we weren't careful. "We need to go," I whisper, pulling Cat away from the clearing. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the dogs were upon us. They burst out of the trees, snarling and snapping, their eyes wild with hunger. There were at least 6 of them, big, vicious animals with sharp teeth and matted fur. I grabbed a stick from the ground and held it out in front of me, trying to keep the dogs at bay. Cat was frozen in fear, her eyes wide as she watched the dogs circle us, their growls growing louder. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll hold them off." But before I could do anything, one of the dogs lunged at us. I swung the stick, hitting it in the side, but it barely fazed the animal. It came at us again, its teeth bared, ready to tear us apart. Just when I thought it was all over, there was a loud crack, and the dog yelped in pain, collapsing to the ground. I looked up, stunned, to see a man standing at the edge of the clearing, a rifle in his hands. He was tall and lean, dressed in camouflage, his face hidden behind a mask. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his gaze on us, cold and calculating. He didn't say a word, just raised the rifle and aimed it at the remaining dogs. One by one, he shot them down, each shot precise and deadly. The dogs fell to the ground, their bodies twitching in the dirt. In a matter of seconds, it was over, and the man lowered his rifle, turning his attention to us. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just stared at us for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Kat and I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. The dogs were dead, but we were far from safe. The hunters were still out there, and now they knew we were too. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Kat nodded, still too shaken to speak. We started walking again, our pace quickening as we left the clearing behind. Every step felt like a step closer to our doom. The hunters were out there, watching, waiting. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor. The air was growing colder, the chill seeping into our bones as we trudged onward. We were exhausted, our bodies aching from the relentless pace, but we couldn't stop. Not now. We were nearing the edge of the estate. I could feel it. The trees were thinning, the ground leveling out. But with every step, the tension grew, a gnawing fear that something terrible was about to happen. And then we heard it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind us. We turned, our hearts pounding, to see a group of men emerging from the trees. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes cold and merciless. The hunters had found us. There were at least 6 of them, all armed with guns, their expressions hidden behind their masks. They moved with a terrifying precision, fanning out to surround us, cutting off any chance of escape. "Run!" I shouted to Kat, pushing her ahead of me. But before we could move, one of the hunters fired his gun, the shot ringing out through the forest. The bullet whizzed past us, missing by inches. They weren't trying to kill us. Not yet. They were toying with us, like cats playing with their prey. We just ran, the adrenaline surging through our veins, pushing us forward. The forest seemed to blur around us as we dodged trees and leaped over roots, the hunters' footsteps pounding ever closer. Every breath burned in my chest, but I didn't dare slow down. Kat was ahead of me, her face pale with fear, but she kept running. I could see the terror in her eyes, the sheer desperation as she tried to outrun the nightmare closing in on us. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her we'd be okay, but I knew it would be a lie. The truth was, we were running out of time. Just as I thought the hunters were about to catch up, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves in a clearing. It was a wide, open space with a towering fence at the far end. Beyond the fence was the estate's boundary. Freedom was so close I could almost taste it. But the hunters were still behind us, and the fence was too tall to climb. My heart sank as I realized we were trapped. Kat and I skidded to a stop, breathing heavily, our eyes darting around for any possible escape. But there was nowhere to go. The clearing was a dead end. The hunters emerged from the trees, fanning out to encircle us. Their faces were still hidden behind their masks, but I could feel their cold, cruel gazes on us. They were savoring this moment, drawing it out as long as possible. "Kat, stay behind me," I whisper, stepping in front of her. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't let them take her, not after everything we'd been through. One of the hunters stepped forward, raising his gun. I braced myself, knowing I couldn't fight them all, but I had to try. I couldn't let them win. Just as the hunter took aim, a sound pierced the air. The wail of sirens, growing louder with every second. The hunters froze, glancing at each other in confusion. They hadn't expected this. I turned to Kat, hope flickering in my chest. "They're coming," I said, my voice trembling. "The police, they're coming." The hunters hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. The sirens were getting closer, the flashing lights of the police cars visible through the trees. For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. Without warning, one of the hunters fired his gun, the bullet whizzing past us. They weren't going to stick around for the police, but they weren't going to leave without taking a shot at us either. I grabbed Kat's hand and pulled her toward the fence, ducking as more bullets flew past. The hunters were retreating, vanishing into the forest, but not before trying to finish us off. We reached the fence and pressed ourselves against it, the metal cold against our backs. The police were just on the other side, their voices echoing through the clearing as they approached. "Over here," I screamed, waving my arms. "Over here." A moment later, the police burst into the clearing, guns drawn. They surrounded us, shouting orders, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was that we were safe, that we'd made it. 2 officers rushed over, pulling us away from the fence and leading us to safety. I collapsed to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me. Kat knelt beside me, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. We held each other, sobbing in relief. We were alive. We'd survived. As the police secured the area, we were escorted to an ambulance, where paramedics checked us over. We were both in shock, our bodies battered and bruised, but we were alive. That was all that mattered. The police arrested the few hunters who hadn't managed to escape, but the others had vanished into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. The officers assured us that they'd track down the rest of them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As we sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in blankets, I looked over at Kat. She was staring off into the distance, her eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't begin to comprehend. "We're safe now," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "It's over." But Kat didn't respond. She just nodded, her expression distant. I knew that we'd both carry the scars of what we'd been through for the rest of our lives. No matter how much time passed, we'd never forget the farm or the horrors we'd witnessed there. As the ambulance drove away from the estate, I glanced back one last time. Trees loomed tall and dark, the estate hidden behind them, but I could still feel the evil that lingered there. The farm wasn't gone, not really. The hunters would move on, find a new place, a new game. And somewhere out there, more women would suffer the same fate. But for now, we were free. Kat and I were together, and that was all that mattered. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.